Hey, um, I had actually read the Cecil Williamson section on my iPad, and the sound was just terrible. Like, you couldn't hear anything. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and read it again. And the pictures might look kind of backwards because I don't know how to flip my phone over for the pictures to be decent, and then I'm doing it on my phone now and not my iPad. So, without further ado, let me get myself situated here. Okay, so I'm gonna try to make a little somewhat of a stand for myself. Okay. Cecil Williamson, a modern cunning man. Cecil Hugh Williamson, from 1909 to 1999, is a hugely important yet relatively overlooked, unrecognized, and all too often unheard of figure in the modern witchcraft revival. He was the founder of what is today named the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic, which began its life on the Isle of Man, eventually settling in the Cornish harbor village of Boscastle, where it remains today. The founding of this world-famous museum, however, is often incorrectly attributed to Gerald B. Gardner, who, by complete contrast, is arguably modern witchcraft's most recognized and celebrated figure. Cecil was born in Paddington, Devon, to well-to-do parents with whom he appears to not have enjoyed a particularly close relationship. Growing up in boarding schools and often holidaying with other relatives, it was during one such holiday with his uncle in Devonshire, North Bovey, that his first encounter with the world of witchcraft occurred and is described in this present book's introduction. At his boarding school in Buckinghamshire, the young Cecil Williamson experienced a direct encounter with witchcraft for a second time. He was being cruelly bullied by a boy he names in some accounts as Balstrode, and it was in hiding from this tormentor one day amongst the trees that he was first introduced to the actual working of magic. He was found by a woman who appears to have worked in the school kitchens, who inquired why Cecil was looking so unhappy. Upon hearing of his problem, she taught the young Cecil how to perform a spell that would rid him of his bully. She took out a small portable swing, hung it from a strong tree branch, and directly beneath it she built a small fire. Cecil was instructed to climb upon the device and swing to and fro through the fire's rising smoke, whilst intoning repeatedly, "Balstrode away, Balstrode away," for no less than 20 minutes. If Cecil repeated this spell each day throughout the holidays, then he would no longer receive any bother from Balstrode. Needing a suitable place to perform his magic whilst home for the holidays, Cecil was fortunate to come by a friendly gamekeeper who agreed to humor the boy and help him build a fire and set up a swing from a suitable tree in the dog cemetery in Hyde Park. So here Cecil continued his spell for 20 minutes each day until the holidays were over. Upon returning to school, Cecil was amazed to find that not only was Balstrode absent, but that he would never be returning, as he had suffered a serious skiing accident, which had left the boy a cripple. Such a striking incident would have most likely impressed vividly upon young Cecil's mind the efficiency and reality of magic and witchcraft, sealing further his interest in this most extraordinary and ancient facet of life. The world of magic would be next encountered in the unlikely setting of East London's impoverished Docklands area, when Cecil Williamson, as a student volunteer, was helping out with a charitable soup kitchen. Here, Cecil again encountered the wise woman and cunning men, working their operative magic for the needs of those in their community. Whilst in London, and later when staying in France with his grandmother, Cecil Williamson also encountered and had first-hand experience of the very different world of high society ceremonial occultism, with its elaborate and often bizarrely disturbing rituals. Such experiences are sure to have left a lasting impression on Cecil, for although he maintained an interest in ceremonial magic, giving it space within his museums, and even experimenting with it in his own work, it seems Cecil was largely suspicious and fairly dismissive of elaborate, organized, and rigid systems of magic, and especially of their associated closed societies and groups. Such things were far removed from the operative magic of what he would come to call the Wayside Witches, whose direct work with the world of spirit force formed the core of his lifelong fascination. After ill-fated attempts to begin careers in the Navy and then the church, Cecil found himself being sent off to work on a tobacco plantation in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. Yet again, there in that strange and distant land, magic was never far from him and persisted in finding its way into Cecil's life. His time in Rhodesia seems to have been a difficult episode in his life, but comfort was drawn from his friendship there with his houseboy, a retired witch doctor named Zandonda. Through Zandonda and his brother craftsmen, Cecil would encounter a form of magic from which he was able to learn a wealth of magical skill and know-how, and yet was at the same time so familiar and reminiscent of the ways of the wise women and wayside witches of home. Upon returning to Britain, Cecil experienced a rather extreme change of scene when he became involved with the film industry, and with some success. At least one movie directed by him is still available today. It was in this more glamorous period of his life that Cecil encountered a good number of the big names of the occult world, including the great beast Aleister Crowley, Dr. Margaret Murray, and Montague Summers. Eventually, through a family friend who also happened to be brother-in-law to the famous occultist and writer Dion Fortune, Cecil became involved with MI6 and the covert monitoring of the rumored occult interests and activities within the German government and its military. Thus began the Witchcraft Research Center, which Cecil would continue to operate for the rest of his life, and which would run as a separate but parallel entity to his later Witchcraft Museum. As well as his covert investigative work, Cecil was also involved in the disseminating of propaganda and disinformation to the Germans, work which necessitated the setting up, of radio installations, one of which was in the North Forest. It was here that Cecil met Mrs. Edith Woodford Grimes, who would again feature in his life via his not always amicable involvement with Gerald B. Gardner, which subsequently began as a result of the two men meeting in London's famous Atlantis bookshop in 1947. The two men, of course, shared a keen interest in the modern survival of witchcraft practices and traditions, albeit with differing views on the nature of the craft. And it was around this time that Cecil Williamson was exploring plans to open a museum devoted to the subject. In his study and exploration of the silent world of witchcraft, Cecil was steadily amassing a collection of artifacts, stories, and practices relating to the modern-day practitioners of traditional and often idiosyncratic ways of magic, with a particular focus upon what he called the Wayside Witches of Devon, Cornwall, and Somerset. Cecil made his first but unsuccessful attempt to establish his museum in Stratford-on-Avon in 1947, when a local doctor had granted him the use of a, by then, disused fire engine garage. It had been built in his garden when it had been requisitioned during the war. As soon as he opened his exhibition, however, he faced such fierce local opposition to the displaying of witchcraft that he found himself run out of town. Thankfully, Cecil was quite determined to achieve his goal and found another location for his museum on the Isle of Man. There he purchased the derelict mill buildings known as the Witches' Mill, due to a local legend that a coven of Mannix witches used to meet there to perform their magical rites. Certainly, there are other cases of the association between old mills and witches. Cecil set about renovating a portion of the buildings and coinciding with the repeal of the Witchcraft Act in 1951. He opened his museum as a folklore center of superstition and witchcraft. Here, the museum was successfully established, apparently free of any serious opposition, and even included its own on-site restaurant called the Witch's Kitchen, which was run by Cecil's wife, Gwen. Having heard of the museum's opening and keen to be involved, a rather disheveled Gerald Gardner, down on his financial luck, traveled to the Isle of Man and turned up on the Williamsons' doorstep, carrying an old music case containing his pajamas and toothbrush. Cecil found a small cottage on the island for Gardner and allowed him to offer unsold copies of his book, High Magic's Aid, for sale in the museum restaurant. Another figure soon to become a vital part of the modern witchcraft movement had also learned of the museum's opening through reading an article in Illustrated. Doreen Valente related in her book, The Rebirth of Witchcraft, that before coming by this article, I had never had any real reason to believe that the witch cult was still active in Britain, or that I could contact it. Seeking more information, Doreen wrote to Cecil Williamson, who passed her inquiry on to Gerald Gardner, who subsequently invited her to meet with him at the home of Edith Woodford Grimes, or Defoe, as she was known, or Defoe. I'm sorry, y'all, if I'm messing up these names. As she was known in the Christchurch area. The following summer, she was initiated by Gerald as a witch, and the rest, as they say, is history. Living in each other's pockets on the Isle of Man did little for Cecil and Gerald's friendship, and the relationship quickly became to sour, perhaps not helped by the fact that the two men had very differing views on the nature of witchcraft. Gerald Gardner's vision was for the establishment of witchcraft as a pagan fertility religion for the masses, with a focus upon ritual celebration and the worship of goddesses and gods within organized initiatory coven structures. To him, the museum was an ideal publicity machine for his recruitment drive, and tensions arose surrounding the prominence he sought to give the display of New Forest witch artifacts. For Cecil, on the other hand, witchcraft was the magical art and craft of the wayside practitioner, operating for the most part on a solitary basis and gaining their knowledge and power via a direct and deeply personal working relationship with the spirit world. This vision of magical, results-based witchcraft was for the few, and Cecil held firmly to the opinion that one could not work effective witchcraft without first attaining a working relationship with a familiar spirit. In various articles, Cecil writes of his surprise and frustration that Gerald Gardner showed no interest in the concept of the familiar spirit, despite its central position within the lore of British witchcraft and folk magic, and it remains curiously absent within the established traditions of Wicca. For Cecil, the reason for this lack of interest lay in the simple fact that Gerald was really rather afraid of the whole idea of spirits. To illustrate this, Cecil delights in giving an account of an incident involving an impressive incense burner in his possession, which, if used in a certain way, with a circle of candles in a draught-free room, would cause columns of smoke to arise and take on uncannily humanoid forms. Cecil confesses, "So I put on a show for Gardner. I asked if he had any pet spirits he wanted to call up. Oh, yes, he said. So he came along all dressed up in his gear, and he had got his sandals on with his toes sticking out and all the rest of it. And he'd got his wand, and he'd got his sword, and he'd got his script, and he'd got his lectern. And he started off banging away there, running through all his names, and the room was getting fuller and fuller of smoke. Bless his heart, he suffered from asthma, so he did start coughing a bit, but give him his due. He had his script there, and everything was proceeding, and the candles were going, and it was warm, and the smoke was going, and he was in full song, and he went on. And then, all of a sudden, he looked up, and there was what just looked like a person in a blessed hood. He took one look at it and cried, 'Good God,' and he was off." Whilst it must, of course, have been an unpleasant episode for all concerned at the time, I am sure a comedy could be written about Cecil and Gerald in their witchcraft museum, and the degeneration of their relationship, which appears to have come to a head with Gerald lunging at Cecil in anger with an athame. Eventually, Cecil decided it was time to move on. He sold the Witch's Mill building to Gerald, loaning him some of his artifacts, and returned with his museum to England, setting up first in Windsor. It was there with his witchcraft exhibition that he met one of the many old-style witches who would teach him something of their ways. He gives her name as Rosa Woodman, the Royal Witch of Windsor, who it seems fulfilled a role as some kind of magical protector of the royal household. Cecil, she was certain, was the right person to become her successor. She taught him a divinatory ritual involving lengthy dances and the throwing of a witch's rosary of 99 acorns, not far from the site of Herney's Oak in Windsor Great Park. Upon Rosa's passing, this magical rosary was bequeathed to Cecil, along with her familiar, a toad named Tim, and her magical turning stick, a naturally twisted walking stick named Sticky. It appears that Cecil was not up to the job of keeping and caring for a toad familiar, and so he found a suitable new home for Tim inside an old tabletop tomb in a graveyard. The rosary of 99 acorns seems to have vanished without a trace, but the turning stick remained with Cecil for the rest of his life. Upon Cecil's death in 1999, the stick was passed to Cecil's friend, the West Country witch Brownie Pate, and upon her passing, Sticky returned along with a number of Brownie's other magical items and notebooks to the museum where it remains on display. Also, while exhibiting his collection in Windsor, Cecil was visited by two men who it seems were royal officials, who politely but firmly explained that Windsor, and we're going to look at some pictures here, y'all. This says the Village Green at North Bovey. So that's the Village Green at North Bovey. Okay. Then we have a Devonshire village wise man and the large stein in which Anne the Toad Witch of North Bovey kept her toads. So here's the Devonshire village wise man. Then we have the Devonshire witch Marion Voden and her collapsed cottage, photographs by Devonshire characters and strange events. That's this one right here. And then West Country witch tools in the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic, Old Martha Woolchase's brazen cauldron, along with Egwon from Umberleigh and a spellstone from Yarcombe, and below the Brideford Witches Memorial. Okay, then we have Cecil Williamson using image magic to perform a counter curse. And then Cecil Williamson's home in the North Devon village of Witheridge. And below are witch bottles from Plymouth in the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic. Okay, and then human skull spirit houses used in Devon. And let's see, what's this here? All right, and then a spirit house made by a Honiton witch using a lace maker's globe filled with hundreds and thousands. Okay. And then the Doer Stone and a common circle. Just some places. And Score Hill Circle and the Tolman Stone. Okay, and then Spinster Rock and the Witch's Rock. And then the Devil's Stone. I think that was from one of the other stories, y'all. Okay, and then Witsman's Wood. And then the Tomb of Squire Cabal and Granite Altar. And a more picture, stone carried against toothache. And rains. Okay. Okay. So that Windsor, but firmly explained that Windsor might not be a suitable home for such a collection, and that he should perhaps relocate. Being people with contacts, it was made clear to him that to aid his relocation, certain strings could be pulled and Cecil would face no issues with planning, etc. And so Cecil and his museum were on the move again and reopened in the pretty Cotswold village of Burton-on-the-Water in 1956. This, however, was not a happy new home for the collection, as local Christians subjected Cecil to a barrage of persecutions, including fire attacks on the museum and the hanging of a dead cat outside. The local vicar even refused to give communion to Cecil's housekeeper and ranted against Cecil and his museum from the pulpit. When the vicar died not long after, suspicion must naturally have arisen that Cecil may have retaliated by magical means, an act Cecil himself neither confirmed nor denied. At this time, Cecil owned property in Cornwall, and so retreated from Burton-on-the-Water to set his museum up in the East Cornish town of Lowie, naming it the House of Spells. Again, however, the Christians of the area made it known that such a museum was not welcome, and so Cecil was forced to make further relocations of the collection. First to Tintagel, where the museum seemed to be welcome but made little money, and again to nearby Boscastle. Not only was this beautiful little harbor village a popular tourist honeypot, but was said to have been home to working sea witches, who would sail the wind, magically tied into knotted rope to sailors. The strange, anomalous atmosphere of the village, its natural harbor, and its wooded valley have often been commented upon, and it is indeed a place that seems to hold a strange attraction for witches and occultists, for it has been home to a good number of such people, which I suspect would still be the case if the museum were not suited there. Finally, finding the perfect location for his collection, Cecil continued to run the museum in Boscastle all the way through to 1996 when he sold it, passing the museum into the capable hands of Graham King. Excuse me, y'all. I find it rather sad that Cecil Williamson seemed to feel he had failed in some way by having never written a book. Of course, the type of witchcraft written by his old associate Gerald Gardner went from being the pursuit of a few small groups in Britain to become a religion followed by countless people all around the world, albeit in a manner often very diluted from Gardner's original vision. The form of witchcraft Cecil Williamson devoted his life to, by contrast, would seem in comparison to have slipped under the radar. But then it always was a way for the few, a way in which Cecil was fully active as a working witch in the old cunning tradition. He was known to have worked for those who sought his help for such traditional matters as the lifting and returning of curses and the recovery of lost or stolen property. Despite having never written books on the subject, Cecil Williamson's influence and his importance to the world of witchcraft is great indeed. His life's work has left a world-famous collection of artifacts viewed, I believe, by more than 50,000 people per year. The artifacts themselves, his accompanying hand-typed description cards, his body of articles, and his archived correspondence culminate to reveal a very different and very potent world of real, hands-on witchcraft and magic that works hand in glove with the silent world of spirit. Time and time again, one hears of or encounters witches and occultists whose work has been directly inspired by Cecil Williamson in his Museum of Witchcraft and Magic. So that's the end of that one, y'all. I'm sure somebody will come in with the encounters with witchery, and it has been nice reading for y'all. I hope y'all could understand me, forgive me where I stumbled, and I will talk to y'all soon. Bye.